Under the cold, persistent rain of a desolate evening on a lonely road, a single mom was making her way home after a brutally long and exhausting day at work when she spotted a man. He was completely drenched, limping badly, and practically dragging himself along the side of the road. Without even a moment's hesitation, she pulled over immediately to check on him and offered him assistance. She brought him back to her place, fixed him a cup of hot tea, and let him warm up by the cozy fireplace. What she didn't yet realize was that this seemingly small act of simple kindness was about to completely and irrevocably change her life, starting the very next day. Before we continue with our story, let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. And please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow I've got something really special lined up just for you. The rain had really been coming down steadily since late afternoon. It wasn't one of those dramatic thunderstorms, but more of a cold, relentless curtain of water that seemed to fall endlessly without any intention of stopping. It was the kind of rain that completely soaked you to the bone the instant you dared to step outside into it. Sarah Whitmore drove with extreme caution along the winding two-lane highway just outside of Brayfield, Pennsylvania, squinting hard past the steady rhythm of the windshield wipers and the dim glow of the headlights as they reflected harshly off the slick, wet asphalt. It was getting late, nearly 8 o'clock. Her shift over at the local bakery had run considerably longer than expected again, and this was already the second time this week, but she hadn't complained about it, not even a single word. That was just Sarah's way of dealing with things. She would simply lend a helping hand wherever and whenever help was needed, and then quietly go back home. She was bone-tired, but not in the usual fleeting sense of simply having had a long and demanding day. This was a much deeper fatigue, a constant, gnawing weariness that seemed to live and fester deep behind her ribs. Her little boy Liam would be patiently waiting back at the house, probably already dozing off to sleep with his favorite book clutched in his hands, and the soft glow of his little night light shaped like a friendly fox casting gentle shadows on the walls. Her thoughts were completely focused on that comforting image, the simple warmth of her home and the faint, reassuring hum of the old heater. It was just then that she noticed him, a solitary figure walking along the desolate side of the road. It took her a second or two to really process what she was seeing, just a quick flash in her peripheral vision, a shadowy shape caught in the act of moving. But as she drove closer and closer, the image became much clearer and more defined. It was a tall, dark-skinned man, walking with a very noticeable limp. He was completely soaked to the bone. His head was bent low against the driving rain, and his hood was pulled way forward. The heavy weight of the wet fabric slumped low over his brow, practically obscuring his face. And his backpack, which looked dark and exceedingly heavy, hung awkwardly and unevenly off of one shoulder. One of his old boots looked completely waterlogged and was probably sloshing with every step he took. She couldn't really make out much of his face, only the strong curve of a defined jawline, the general shape of a frame that had obviously once been extremely strong and fit, and still seemed to be trying to maintain that strength despite the circumstances. Sarah's fingers tightened their grip on the cold steering wheel. She didn't slow down right away. Not at first. A quiet warning voice stirred deep within her mind. It wasn't really her own voice, but more like one stitched together from years and years of learned instincts and ingrained fears. Don't stop. Not this late at night. Not for some complete stranger. Not for a man walking completely alone on a deserted back road. And especially not for a black man. Especially not all alone. Especially not right now. She absolutely hated that thought, and hated even more that it had come to her mind completely unbidden and without her permission. The truck kept moving steadily forward. The wipers scraped noisily back and forth across the windshield. Her jaw clenched up tight. Her eyes remained rigidly locked on the empty, rain-slicked road ahead. But deep behind her ribs, something else tugged at her conscience. She definitely knew that particular look, the weary posture of someone who was carrying way too much on their shoulders, the labored steps of someone who had absolutely nowhere else on earth to go. Her father's kind voice echoed quietly in the deep silence of her memory. If nobody else stops to help, maybe it's because you're the one who's meant to do it. She passed him by maybe 100 feet or so, Then, almost involuntarily, her foot lifted off the gas pedal. Her father had proudly served his country back in the day. He rarely ever spoke about his time in the military, but he always made it a point to slow down whenever he saw someone broken down on the side of the road. He always carried a thick thermal blanket in the back seat of his car, just in case. He'd always say, "You just never really know what kind of war they've just come back from." Sarah exhaled sharply through her nose, the breath coming out both quick and short, and then gently eased the truck over onto the muddy shoulder of the road. The rain hammered relentlessly against the metal roof of the cab. She reversed slowly and deliberately, until the lonely figure came back into view once again, now brightly illuminated by her headlights, the thick mist visibly rising off the wet pavement all around him. She only cracked her window halfway, letting in a blast of frigid air and the distinct scent of mud and gasoline. "Hey!" she called out, trying to keep her voice calm and steady. "Are you okay out here?" The man stopped walking immediately, but he didn't look over at her right away. He stayed completely still for a moment, the cold rain pattering loudly off of his hooded jacket. Then he turned slightly, just enough for the dim light from her truck to catch the side of his face. He was actually much younger than she had initially expected, maybe in his early 30s, but there was definitely something about the overall way he carried himself that made him seem so much older than his actual years. A long, jagged scar ran distinctly down the right side of his face, raised and angry-looking, stretching all the way from his temple down to his jawline. His dark eyes were sharp and very intelligent, but also cautious and wary. He stepped closer to the truck, moving slowly and deliberately. "I'm not looking for any trouble," he said quietly. His voice was low and a little hoarse, but surprisingly controlled. Sarah looked at him intently, really taking him in, and answered without any hesitation whatsoever. "I didn't say that you were." For a long second, neither one of them moved a muscle. Rain continued to spill steadily off the edge of her open window. Then, without another word being spoken, she simply reached across the worn seat and unlocked the passenger side door. "I can drop you off near the old base road, if that's where you're headed." He didn't answer her immediately. Instead, he carefully scanned the interior of the truck, his dark eyes taking in every detail. Not in a suspicious way, but more like he was just carefully calculating, measuring the inherent risk involved. That particular kind of heightened vigilance and awareness wasn't really something you could just simply turn off after having lived through a harrowing combat situation, or even much, much worse. After a long, tense moment, he finally nodded once in quiet agreement. "Yeah, thanks." He gingerly climbed up into the truck, placing one large hand firmly on the dashboard for added balance. Sarah couldn't help but notice the slight wince of pain that flickered across his face as he sat down. The way he subtly shifted his weight to take pressure off of his obviously injured right leg. His old jacket, though, bore a faded military patch, an old army insignia that was barely even visible under the dark, wet fabric. He smelled distinctly of rain, of musty old canvas, and something else that was strangely metallic, almost like worn blood or rusted steel. She put the truck back into gear and carefully merged back onto the main road. The wipers groaned noisily. "You served?" she asked, carefully keeping her tone both even and non-judgmental. "Yeah," he replied after a noticeable pause. "Discharged just 2 weeks ago. Honorable, at least, but that's about the only kind they'd actually let me leave with." The words earned a tired, cynical smirk, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. They drove along in silence for a good while. No music playing on the radio, no friendly chatter to break the tension, just the steady drumming of the heavy rain against the glass and the occasional squelch of the truck's wet tires rolling over the blacktop. Sarah glanced over at him quickly while they were stopped at a red light. His dark hair was cropped extremely close to his scalp. His skin, even beneath the dim glow of the overhead light, was deeply worn by the harsh sun and the relentless passage of time. That ugly scar on his face seemed to catch the faint light from the dashboard, almost like it had been deliberately carved there on purpose. His broad shoulders were slumped slightly, and there was a definite air of tension in the way he held them, as if he was constantly prepared for the next hurtful insult, the next unfair assumption, the next locked door. "Are you from this area?" she asked cautiously. No, ma'am. Just passing through. Trying to get all the way to Wilton. That's a pretty long walk, at least 20 miles or so. He merely shrugged one shoulder in response. Didn't really have many other options available to me. What about the VA? He chuckled humorlessly. No joy there. They helped me get out, and that was pretty much the end of it. They passed the old turnoff to the now-abandoned military base. The faded sign was almost completely rusted through. Sarah slowed the truck and glanced over towards the heavily padlocked gate, which was now almost completely overgrown with thick weeds and thorny bushes. I can definitely let you off right here, but do you even have somewhere to stay tonight? He didn't answer her directly, but just stared straight ahead out the front windshield. She tried again, her voice softer this time. Do you have somewhere dry to go? He finally turned to face her then, and she saw it clearly, if only just a quick flicker of emotion, but it was definitely there. Not vulnerability, and not even outright need, but just a kind of profoundly exhausted honesty. No, I don't. Sarah nodded once quietly. I've got a couch you can use. He didn't respond to her offer right away. He just blinked slowly once and then said, almost inaudibly, finally, thank you. The short drive back to Sarah's small house didn't really take very long at all, but it somehow felt much longer than usual. The truck's old heater, though still technically working, could barely even keep up with the bone-chilling dampness that crept steadily in through the vents. The air between the two of them was strangely quiet. Not exactly tense, but definitely careful. It was the kind of quiet that deliberately asked for both personal space and a whole lot of much-needed patience. Terence sat rigidly with his back held mostly straight, his large hands resting carefully in his lap, his fingers loosely laced together. He didn't fidget or tap his foot nervously. He didn't lean back or slouch down into the worn seat. He held himself with a disciplined calm that didn't really feel very relaxed. It felt more like something that had been trained into him over a long period of time. Sarah kept glancing his way whenever they stopped at signs or turned corners, noticing the subtle way his restless eyes never really rested on any one thing for very long. He scanned everything slowly, constantly checking the side mirrors, the dashboard, the road ahead of them. She didn't press him with any more personal questions. Something about him made it very clear that he would willingly answer if directly asked, but he would only offer up what was absolutely necessary, and she wasn't entirely sure that she really needed to know anything else about him right now. When they finally pulled into the small gravel driveway, the old porch light flickered erratically twice before finally settling into a soft, comforting amber glow. Sarah carefully parked the truck and cut the engine completely. The sound of the pounding rain suddenly became louder and much more present without the engine's constant hum to mask it. She reached over, quickly grabbing her reusable grocery tote from the floor of the passenger seat and slinging it casually over her shoulder. You can come inside now, she said, carefully keeping her voice even. Just for tonight. I've definitely got a couch. Terence looked directly at her for a long, unreadable moment, his own expression completely inscrutable, then finally gave a slight nod of quiet acceptance. Appreciate it. She led the way slowly up the porch steps, her keys jangling softly in her hand and her old boots squishing quietly against the wet, weathered wood. When she finally unlocked the front door, the warm, inviting smell of sweet cinnamon and old pine wood wafted pleasantly out to greet them. She stepped inside first, quickly flicked on the hallway light, then moved towards the small kitchen, flipping one more light switch that bathed the main room in a soft, welcoming yellow glow. The entire space wasn't very large at all, just an open kitchen area, a well-worn couch facing a loaded bookshelf, a small television set, and a battered coffee table with Liam's colorful coloring books scattered carelessly underneath. She didn't bother to apologize for the disorganized mess. She rarely had any extra time to tidy up after a long day at work. And tonight certainly wasn't the kind of night for pretending that things were more put together than they actually were. Terence carefully stepped inside and paused for just a split second. Then he set his heavy backpack down gently near the wall, slipped off his wet, mud-caked boots and stood quietly, his rigid posture still carefully guarded, but thankfully no longer quite so tense. Sarah quickly opened a nearby cabinet and grabbed a clean towel, holding it out towards him without any unnecessary fanfare. Dry off a little bit. You'll definitely get sick sitting around like that all wet. "Thanks," he said, as he reached out and took the offered towel. His rough fingers brushed hers lightly for just a fleeting second. His hands were surprisingly rough and cold to the touch, the hard calluses clearly earned through a lifetime of hard work. He patted down his wet face, neck, and shoulders slowly and deliberately, almost like he wasn't really used to being dry indoors anymore. She put a kettle on the old stove, pulled 2 clean mugs down from the cluttered shelf, and without even asking how he liked it, dropped a soothing chamomile tea bag into each one. The small kitchen was quiet except for the kettle slowly warming on the stove and the steady sound of water still dripping from his heavy coat down onto the aged hardwood floor. "You can sit down if you want," she said, gesturing casually towards the worn couch. He nodded once in quiet agreement and did so, moving slowly and deliberately. Sarah noticed him yet again as he adjusted himself carefully into a more comfortable seated position, obviously favoring his injured right side. She thought briefly about asking him if he was badly injured, but then quickly held back. Instead, she simply poured the steaming hot water carefully into the 2 mugs, carried them both over, and set one politely down on the low coffee table in front of him. "Sugar's in that old jar over there," she offered helpfully. "Plain is just fine," he replied quietly. She sat down in the comfortable chair across from him, being careful not to sit either too close or too far away. She sipped her tea slowly and surreptitiously studied him in a way she sincerely hoped wasn't too obvious. The dim lamp next to the couch gave off just enough soft light for her to see more of him now. His skin, which was deep brown in color, glistened faintly from the lingering rain. The ugly scar down his strong face was still somewhat red at the edges, indicating that it was actually much newer than she had initially thought. His dark eyes, though tired, didn't really seem cold or menacing. They just seemed indescribably weary. Not the kind of soul-deep tired that a simple night's sleep could ever possibly fix. A soft shuffling sound from the hallway made them both quickly glance towards the doorway. A small, sleepy figure stood near the far corner. Liam was barefoot and clutching his favorite stuffed fox tightly to his small chest. His pajama pants were bunched adorably up at the ankles. His young eyes were wide and extremely curious, but definitely not afraid. Sarah stood up slowly and cautiously. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said softly, walking slowly over to him. "We've just got a visitor tonight. Why don't you go on back to bed now?" "Okay." Liam looked questioningly over at Terence, then back up at his mother, then nodded his head slowly. "Is he a friend?" Sarah hesitated just for a brief moment. "He's just someone who needed a ride," she replied honestly. Liam didn't ask any more questions. He just yawned sleepily and turned away. "Tell him I don't mind if he uses my soft blanket. The blue one is softer." Sarah smiled gently. "Thanks, bud." When she returned to the living room, Terence was simply staring intently at the steaming cup in front of him, almost as if it somehow held some kind of profound secret. She sat back down in her chair, this time feeling a little bit more relaxed. Still no prying questions. Still no unfair assumptions being made. "I've got some extra sheets if you need them," she offered quietly. "The couch isn't much, but it thankfully doesn't creak as loudly as it used to." He looked up at her again, not with suspicion this time, but with something that looked a lot like confusion, or maybe even quiet disbelief. "You don't actually have to do any of this. I know that perfectly well. I don't have anything to give you in return. I didn't ask you for anything in the first place." He looked quietly down, then cautiously picked up the warm mug, holding it carefully with both of his large hands as if it was somehow physically grounding him. "You'd actually be really surprised at just how many people will say that they're not judging you, and then they just go ahead and do it anyway." Sarah tilted her head slightly in response. "You didn't really give me any legitimate reason to," she pointed out gently. He didn't respond to that, but he did begin to carefully drink the warm tea slowly and deliberately, almost like it had been a very long time since anyone had bothered to make him something warm simply because they could. Later, after carefully setting out a soft pillow and a thin blanket on the old couch, Sarah quietly retreated to her own bedroom. She didn't bother to lock the door. She thought about doing it almost reflexively, but then stopped herself. Something about him just didn't feel genuinely threatening. He definitely felt unsettled, yes, but definitely not dangerous. She lay in her bed, staring up blankly at the darkened ceiling, listening intently to the comfortable quiet of the house. No unsettling creaking sounds, no unexpected shifting noises, just the steady sound of the rain falling steadily outside and the faint, familiar ticking of the old kitchen clock. When morning finally came, it wasn't actually the sound of movement or even a door closing that woke her from her light sleep. It was actually the sudden, almost palpable stillness of the house. She walked sleepily out into the kitchen to start brewing the morning coffee, and then stopped abruptly. The old couch was empty. The pillow and the thin blanket had been neatly folded. The clean towel he'd used the night before was now completely dry, hung meticulously over the back of the kitchen chair. But what really caught her wandering eye, what made her freeze completely mid-step, was what was lying quietly beside the kitchen sink. A small, worn piece of metal. The familiar purple ribbon was faded and worn, and the smooth metal itself felt cool against the clean countertop. Purple heart. Sarah's breath caught sharply in her throat. She didn't touch it at first. She just stared silently down at it as if it were somehow something sacred and almost holy. Not so much because of what it actually was, but because of everything it truly meant. That the quiet, haunted man who had sat right here in her very own kitchen in respectful silence with his obvious scars and his carefully guarded silence and his heavy backpack had obviously seen very real battle, had endured very real pain, and had then left this most precious of tokens behind. Eventually, she finally reached out and picked it up gently, carefully wrapping it in a clean dishcloth and quietly placing it deep inside the second drawer near the humming refrigerator. She didn't know exactly why she felt compelled to do so. She just instinctively knew that she definitely couldn't just simply leave it out in the open like it was some kind of unwanted or discarded object. It clearly belonged somewhere it could safely rest undisturbed. She didn't tell anyone about what had happened. Not her talkative neighbor, not her closest friend Nora, and not even her inquisitive young son Liam. That morning, she simply went about her usual daily routine. Making toast, packing lunches, and getting Liam safely off to school. But something deep inside of her was definitely quieter than usual. Not necessarily sad, but just extremely full. Full of unanswered questions, full of lingering echoes, full of a heavy weight that she somehow didn't quite know how to accurately name. The treasured purple heart stayed carefully hidden in the drawer, nestled between a tightly wound rubber band ball, a dried-out ballpoint pen, and a special hand-drawn note from Liam that read, "You're the best mom ever," scrawled in bright orange crayon. She honestly didn't really know what to do with any of it. So, just like always, she simply kept going, hoping desperately that the persistent feeling would somehow just fade away with the passing of time. The small kitchen somehow felt colder that morning, not because of the chilly weather outside, but simply because Terrence was now gone. No heartfelt goodbye, no lingering trace of where he may have gone, just that neatly folded towel lying so carefully on the worn armrest, still faintly damp from his recent use, and the small, significant piece of cool metal lying beside the kitchen sink. A purple heart, faded slightly at the well-worn edges, almost like it had been carried for way too long in way too many unknown places. Sarah didn't touch it right away. She simply couldn't. Something about the sheer emotional weight of it, the profound meaning it clearly carried, made her own hands feel far too ordinary and unworthy to even hold it. Instead, she just stood silently at the cold counter, slowly letting the steam rise from her untouched cup of lukewarm tea, while Liam shuffled sleepily into the kitchen with his favorite blanket wrapped tightly around his small shoulders, rubbing the lingering sleep from his tired eyes. "Is he gone already, Mama?" Liam asked quietly, his voice unusually soft, almost like he was genuinely afraid that simply saying the actual words out loud would somehow only make it even more true. Sarah nodded slowly. She didn't actually say anything at first. She just gently brushed his messy hair back off of his pale forehead and quietly told him to go and grab his warmest socks before the drafty old kitchen got any colder. That was it. No further explanation given. No real unpacking of all the powerful emotions that were currently swirling chaotically in her chest. Just socks, toast, and a healthy school lunch to pack. Life, as always, just pushed quickly forward without her. She placed the hidden metal carefully in the kitchen drawer later that same day, wrapping it meticulously in one of her beloved mother's old, worn dishcloths and gently laying it beside a few loose buttons, some long-expired coupons, and a crumpled drawing Liam had made of their old trailer sitting safely beneath a brilliantly colored rainbow. She didn't tell anyone about it. Not her sympathetic friend Nora, not any of the other girls over at the bakery, and definitely not her overbearing mother, who would have immediately demanded a whole bunch of answers that Sarah simply couldn't possibly give. The entire thing somehow just felt far too fragile and too personal to accurately explain to anyone. A completely quiet and selfless act of simple kindness that somehow just seemed to mean both everything and absolutely nothing all at the exact same time. So, she just did what people like her had always habitually done. She carefully folded it all neatly away, tucking all of the powerful emotions carefully behind her sense of daily duty, and then just simply tried her absolute best to slowly move on with her increasingly complicated life. Or at least she sincerely tried to. Then, just 3 days later, the fateful letter finally came. The envelope was thick and cream-colored, and looked extremely official and important with her full name printed in bold block letters right across the front. No personal handwriting, no postage stamps, just a printed return address. Maple Ridge Credit Union. She sat numbly at the kitchen table for nearly 20 long minutes before she finally worked up the courage to even open it, absently tracing the sharp edge of the sealed flap with her shaking thumbnail. When she finally unfolded the crisp letter, her fearful eyes locked almost immediately onto the very first line of the official-looking document. Notice of foreclosure proceedings. Immediate attention required. Her stomach dropped sharply. They were definitely behind on the payments. She knew that much. Ever since the bakery had cruelly cut back her already limited working hours, she'd basically just been scraping by desperately baking fancy cakes for her kind neighbors late into the long nights, slowly selling her late mother's precious old jewelry piece by piece at the local pawn shop, and even canceling their precious internet service not once, but twice, until Liam's concerned teacher had called her to point out that he really needed it for all of his crucial schoolwork. But she had foolishly thought that they still had quite a bit more precious time left to spare. She had desperately thought that maybe the next paycheck would somehow be just enough. Maybe the understanding loan officer would be kind and understanding. Maybe the bank wouldn't actually follow through with the dreaded foreclosure. But banks didn't actually run on kindness and empty promises. They only ran on hard dates and exact digits and non-negotiable deadlines. Sarah slowly read the frightening letter twice, and then a third time just to be completely sure. 30 days. That was all the precious time she actually had left until the beloved home that her own father had painstakingly built with his own two calloused hands. With its old patched roof and its leaning storage shed and its small vegetable garden that Liam faithfully planted bright sunflowers in every single spring would be officially listed, then unceremoniously auctioned off to the very highest bidder, and then gone forever. She didn't cry. Not at that particular moment. Instead, she carefully took the frightening letter, slowly folded it with trembling hands, and then placed it gently beside the carefully wrapped purple heart deep inside the kitchen drawer. Then she just went to work. At the bustling bakery. No one even noticed the crushing emotional weight that she was so obviously carrying around with her. Sarah still wore the same familiar soft smile, still poured hot coffee into the same familiar chipped mugs, and still asked Officer Jim good-naturedly if he wanted an extra sprinkle of cinnamon on his morning order. She still teased Nora fondly about her incredibly ridiculous blind dates and offered the bakery's regular customers a warm, flaky croissant along with their usual slice of freshly baked pie. She was still the exact same dependable Sarah Bennett that everyone knew and relied on. The one who never actually asked for any help, the one who always faithfully showed up on time, the one who never let anything negative actually show on her face. But deep down inside, she was quietly fraying. The long, exhausting late nights were stretching out even longer than before, and the stack of unpaid bills was slowly piling even higher. She'd sadly begun to measure her precious time, not in happy days, but in the endless number of dreaded overdue notices that somehow kept showing up in their mailbox. And every single night when Liam finally fell fast asleep clutching his beloved stuffed raccoon, she would often find herself sitting alone in the cold kitchen, staring blankly at the soft towel that Terence had once carefully folded, silently wondering what kind of complicated man even leaves behind a rare metal like that and why she just simply couldn't stop thinking about him. One quiet evening, as she was wiping down the already clean counters for the third time in only 10 minutes. Her close friend Nora finally set down her wet mop and leaned curiously against the doorway. "All right, what is it?" she said. Sarah looked up, genuinely confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you completely forgot it was snack day. You accidentally gave poor Officer Jim plain black coffee this morning. And you haven't even rolled your eyes at my truly terrible dating life all week. Something's definitely off with you, girl. So just spill it already." There was a long beat of strained silence between them. Then Sarah just quietly did. Not the entire complicated story, of course, but thankfully just enough to get the basic point across. She told Nora about the mysterious man on the road, the sudden rainstorm, the kind offer of her couch, and the forgotten Purple Heart medal. She didn't really mention the whole race thing directly, although she really didn't even have to. Nora, sharp as ever, had already accurately understood the underlying point. She then haltingly told her about the dreaded letter, the looming foreclosure, and the persistent, overwhelming sense that everything she had worked so hard to carefully build was sadly slipping right out from completely under her bare feet. Nora didn't interrupt her at all. She didn't gasp in exaggerated shock or offer a judgmental lecture, or even ask why Sarah hadn't bothered to say anything sooner. She just leaned silently back against the cold doorway and then said simply, "That just really sucks." It was honestly the very most honest and genuine thing that anyone had said to her in several long weeks. Sarah let out a short, involuntary laugh, a very brief and exhausted sound that quickly cracked and faded at the well-worn edges. "Yeah," she whispered quietly, "it really does." That night back at her house, Sarah gently tucked her sleeping son Liam into his old bed, and then sat quietly alone at the cold kitchen table long after the entire house had finally gone completely still. Outside, the biting wind suddenly picked up, rattling the loose shutters on the old house just enough to keep her anxiously on edge. The familiar drawer beside her creaked faintly when she opened it, almost as if even the inanimate furniture itself was somehow weary. She carefully took the treasured medal back out once again, slowly running her roughened thumb gently across the frayed purple ribbon. She still sadly hadn't told Liam exactly what it was, or even who it had actually belonged to. Some deep, unspoken part of her somehow felt like it really wasn't hers to explain to him. And yet, she honestly couldn't bring herself to simply let go of it either. As she just sat there quietly, the soft hum of the worn-out refrigerator, the only sound in the otherwise silent room, she sadly thought about just how incredibly easy it would actually be to finally give up, to just let the old house go, to pack up everything and then just move in with her overbearing mother, and then just somehow start all over again somewhere smaller and far less complicated. People just did it all the time. But then she immediately thought of the simple look of such pure joy and utter contentment in young Liam's bright eyes whenever he was carefully watering the small garden, and the familiar sound of his quick footsteps as he cheerfully ran gleefully across the old wooden floorboards. And she just instinctively knew that she honestly couldn't actually do it. Not just yet. Because this old house wasn't just an old roof and some rotting walls. It was actually the physical embodiment of cherished memory. It was hard sweat and rich soil and loving bedtime stories. It was the very last real thing she had left in this world that actually felt entirely like it was hers. And somehow, even though he was already long gone, the lingering presence of that exceptionally quiet man with the haunted eyes and the soldier's ugly scar somehow made her just barely believe, if only just for a precious moment, that maybe she somehow wasn't completely alone in this brutal fight. She carefully folded the soft towel again, slowly placed the cool metal back in the darkened drawer, and then whispered quietly into the still silence, "Wherever you are right now, thank you." Then she slowly turned off the cold light and wearily climbed back into her own bed, carefully bracing herself for whatever life might now bring her next. Because it honestly wasn't just simple kindness that had unexpectedly visited her that fateful night. It was sadly something much more profound. And deep down inside, she honestly wasn't quite ready to just give up on it entirely. Not just yet. Sarah honestly wasn't really expecting to receive anything much in the mail except for more bills. So, when the pale envelope unexpectedly arrived without any kind of return address or even a valid postage stamp, it honestly gave her pause. The flowing handwriting was sharp, upright, and unmistakably deliberate. Each individual letter of her name was carefully written with the kind of extreme care that actually made her stomach tighten nervously before she even bothered to actually open it. The thick paper inside the envelope was also heavier than usual, the kind of expensive paper that was normally only used for very important letters that were somehow definitely meant to be carefully remembered. She carefully unfolded it, half expecting it to just be another frustrating form of crushing disappointment. But instead, there it simply was. A single carefully written line, with no fancy flourish, no kind greeting, just "You reminded me I still mattered." She read it over once, and then over again. Her shaking hands didn't visibly tremble, but her breath caught in her throat, coming out both quiet and quite sudden. There was absolutely no question in her mind as to who had actually written it. It was the sad man who had said so very little, the one who had simply disappeared without a proper. She'd always had a way with words, managing to pack more meaning into a single sentence than some people could in their entire lives. Sarah held the piece of paper like it was made of spun glass, carefully folding it once before tucking it beside the Purple Heart in the drawer beneath the old dish towel. For a brief moment, that simple act settled something inside her. It confirmed that what she'd done, the choice she'd made that night, had resonated with someone. And in a world where her inherent kindness was beginning to feel like a burden, that validation held more weight than she dared to admit aloud. But the solace was fleeting. 2 days later, just before the clock struck noon, a knock echoed through the house. It wasn't forceful or aggressive, just the measured rhythm of someone accustomed to authority and driven by purpose. Sarah dried her hands on a kitchen towel and opened the door to find Sheriff Dunning standing on her porch. His uniform immaculate, one hand resting on his belt. His face was devoid of any warmth. "Miss Bennet," he said with a nod. "Mind if I ask you a few questions?" She instinctively stepped aside, unsure of what else to do. He didn't accept her invitation to sit, didn't remove his hat, but stood in the center of her living room as if assessing damage. "Had a few folks call about a man seen leaving your place a week back," he stated, his voice even. "Big guy, black, walked with a limp. You know anything about that?" Sarah met his gaze head-on, choosing her words with deliberate care. "He needed help," she explained. "It was raining. I gave him a place to rest. That's all." Dunning's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he remained silent for a moment. "Did he say his name?" he asked, his eyes never leaving hers. She shook her head. "No, he didn't offer, and I didn't ask." He let out a quiet exhale, a sound laced with both disbelief and a subtle warning. "You should be more careful, Sarah," he said, his tone softening slightly but remaining firm. "Folks get nervous when strangers show up out of nowhere, especially ones who look like they don't belong." "He didn't do anything wrong," she replied, her voice a little sharper than intended. Dunning raised his eyebrows, a gesture of mild surprise. "I didn't say he did," he countered. "But in times like these, people make assumptions. Don't give them a reason to." He departed without further incident, but the unspoken tension he left behind clung to her walls like the lingering scent of smoke. That evening, when Liam came home and asked if someone had stopped by, she brushed it off, saying it was just the sheriff checking on things. He nodded absently and moved on, as kids often do. But Sarah couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something intangible had shifted in the atmosphere. The next morning, as she walked Liam to the bus stop, she noticed it scrawled on the wall near the mailbox. Faded spray paint, hurriedly applied. 3 words, "White sympathizer." She stopped walking, her blood turning to ice. Liam tugged on her coat sleeve, his voice filled with youthful impatience. "Mom." She quickly composed herself, forcing a smile as she ruffled his hair and gently urged him onto the bus. "Have a good day, sweetheart." But beneath the surface, her heart was pounding. Not from fear, not yet, but from a chilling, creeping understanding. Someone had seen her act of kindness. Someone disapproved. And someone had decided to voice their disapproval loud enough for the whole town to see. Back inside, Sarah sank onto the edge of the couch, the cushion still bearing the faint imprint of where Terence had slept. She stared out the window at the defaced wall, the words burning into her mind. The message didn't sting because it was untrue. It stung because it was deliberate, because it revealed the true nature of the place she lived in, a place that offered friendship only as long as you stayed within the prescribed boundaries. She had momentarily stepped outside those lines, just for a night, and now she was being forcibly pushed back in. Later that day at the bakery, Carolyn casually inquired if everything was all right. Sarah simply nodded, offering a tight smile. She always nodded, even when her stomach was churning and her thoughts were a chaotic whirlwind, even when she felt the sideways glances from other parents at the grocery store, even when she overheard two women whispering at the post office about the woman who let him in. That night, after Liam had drifted off to sleep, Sarah cautiously opened the drawer. The metal was still there, gleaming softly in the dim light. The note, too, lay undisturbed. She held the paper in her hand once more and whispered, her voice barely audible. Was I wrong? She couldn't discern whether she was questioning her decision to offer shelter, her choice to remain silent in the face of scrutiny, or her willingness to believe that a simple act of kindness could still hold meaning. But the question lingered in the air, unanswered and heavy. And then, with a sigh, she carefully folded the letter again and placed it back in the drawer, handling it with the tenderness reserved for something precious and fragile. Because regardless of the town's whispers and judgments, she knew what she had seen in that man's eyes, the eyes of someone who desperately needed to be seen. And she had seen him. She had consciously chosen not to look away. And perhaps, even if no one else could comprehend it, that choice still held inherent value. It happened on a Tuesday late in the morning. Sarah was diligently pulling weeds along the fence line that bordered the back of her small garden. The sun had finally broken through after 3 days of oppressive grayness, and the air was thick with the earthy scent of damp soil and decaying leaves. She was kneeling, her hands caked with dirt, her mind lulled into a meditative state by the repetitive motion of yanking dandelions from the ground, when she heard the unmistakable sound of a car door closing. Not the hurried slam of a delivery driver, but a deliberate, firm, and careful closure. She stood up, brushing the dirt from her hands onto her jeans, and walked toward the front yard, her boots crunching on the gravel with each step. She wasn't expecting anyone. First, she didn't recognize him. He was standing tall, no longer hunched over by pain or exhaustion, and his clothes were clean and pressed with sharp creases that hadn't been there before. But it was his eyes that truly struck her, stopping her in her tracks. They were steady, calm, still carrying a lingering shadow, but noticeably clearer now. He wasn't alone. 2 other men stood beside him, both in crisp, military-style uniforms, both watching her with calm and respectful expressions. One of them held a sealed envelope, while the other carried a small, unassuming case tucked neatly under one arm. Sarah cautiously opened the gate, her heart pounding in her chest. "Terence," she said, a question in her voice. He nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, then spoke in that same low, resonant voice she remembered, but now with an added weight of authority. "I wanted to say thank you properly." She glanced at the men standing behind him, her brow furrowed with uncertainty, her pulse quickening with each passing second. Liam, hearing the unfamiliar voices, peeked out from the window, his eyes wide with curiosity. Terence noticed him and offered a soft, reassuring smile before turning his attention back to Sarah. "These are my colleagues," he explained. "Captain Boyd, Sergeant Mason. We're here on behalf of the Department of Veterans Affairs and myself." Sarah felt her throat tighten, making it difficult to speak. "You didn't have to," she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. "Yes, I did," he countered, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You opened your door to a stranger. No questions asked, no judgment passed. That shouldn't be a rare thing, but it is, and it mattered profoundly." The captain stepped forward, extending the sealed envelope toward her. "This is a formal letter of acknowledgement for your service to a veteran in crisis," he explained, his voice clear and professional. "You also qualified for support through our civilian community bond program. There was a fund established years ago specifically for situations like this. It's been significantly underutilized." She took the envelope with trembling fingers, feeling as though she were caught between a dream and reality. The second man opened the small case he was carrying and pulled out a folder, his movements precise and deliberate. We reviewed the lien on your property stemming from the actions taken by Mr. Hampton and the supporting documentation provided, he stated, speaking clearly and concisely. We submitted a request for debt forgiveness. As of this morning, the foreclosure has been rescinded. Your mortgage is cleared. The home is yours, free and clear. Sarah blinked, struggling to process the information. The words hit her one by one, like refreshing raindrops after a prolonged drought. Mortgage cleared. Home, hers. I don't understand, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. I didn't do anything that special. Terrence shook his head, his gaze unwavering. You did something almost no one else would have, he said, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. You saw me. Liam, unable to contain his curiosity any longer, opened the door and stepped barefoot onto the porch. Is that the man who drank the tea? He asked, his eyes wide with wonder. Sarah half laughed, half sobbed, overwhelmed by the moment. Yes, baby, she replied, her voice cracking with emotion. That's him. Liam looked at the men in uniform, then back at his mother, his young mind trying to grasp the situation. So, because you gave tea to a stranger, we get to keep our house? Sarah crouched down, pulling him into a tight embrace, tears streaming down her face. Yeah, we do, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Terrence stepped forward slightly, careful not to intrude on their moment. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small photograph, old and faded. This is my brother, he said, his voice filled with a quiet sadness. He didn't make it home, but if he had, I'd hope someone would have done for him what you did for me. Sarah took the photograph gently, nodding in understanding, too overcome with emotion to speak. Captain Boyd cleared his throat, breaking the silence. We'll be in touch, he said, his tone professional but kind. We'd like to feature your story in the community newsletter, if that's all right. Might help folks see things differently. Sarah managed a small, hesitant smile. We'll see. When the men finally departed, Sarah stood in the yard with Liam clinging to her side, the envelope still clutched tightly in her hand. She didn't open it right away. She didn't need to. The tightness in her chest was already beginning to dissipate, replaced by a sense of profound relief and overwhelming gratitude. Inside, she carefully placed the documents next to the Purple Heart and the note, creating a drawer filled with quiet proofs of the impact of her actions. This time, she didn't close the drawer immediately. She allowed it to remain open for a while, letting the fresh air circulate through it, as if those simple objects needed to breathe, too. Later that night, Liam sat at the kitchen table, meticulously drawing a picture of their house, the same scene he always depicted, but this time with a small American flag proudly displayed on the roof and 3 stick figures standing outside. He handed it to her with a wide, beaming grin. That's us, he exclaimed, his eyes sparkling with joy. And that's the man who came back. Sarah looked at the picture for a long time, her heart swelling with love and hope. In the drawing, they were all smiling, radiating happiness and contentment. And for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to truly believe that maybe, just maybe, they would be okay. The letter arrived a few days later, folded neatly in thirds and slipped into her mailbox without ceremony. Just 2 days after Terrence and the officers had left her porch. Sarah nearly discarded it, mistaking it for another generic grocery flyer, but the official seal on the corner caught her eye. A pale gold insignia from the county land office. A knot formed in her stomach as she carefully opened the envelope. The words inside were precise, legalistic, and devoid of any warmth, conveying a sense of cold detachment. The letter reaffirmed the county's intent to reclaim the back portion of her lot. The language was colder this time, stripped of any pretense of goodwill. The message was simple and direct. That land was no longer protected. It was now simply real estate, subject to the ruthless forces of the market. Sarah stood on the edge of the property that evening, gazing out at the blackened soil where her father used to cultivate his prized tomatoes. The ash crunched ominously beneath her boots, a stark reminder of the recent fire. She clutched the letter in one hand, her other resting heavily on the weathered fence post, the acrid smell of smoke still clinging to the air like a lingering warning. She didn't cry this time. She simply didn't have the energy. She stood there, weary but defiant, unsure of what her next move should be. Terence pulled up just as the sun began its descent behind the trees, casting long, dramatic shadows across the landscape. He didn't utter a word at first, simply walking over to stand beside her. His presence a quiet source of strength and solidarity. "They're still coming after it," she said, her voice flat and toneless, not bothering to turn to face him. "I figured," he replied with a knowing sigh, then added, "Let me make a call." Sarah looked at him, her eyes searching his for answers. "To who, the mayor?" she asked, skepticism lacing her tone. "The governor? Because unless one of them owes you a serious favor." "Not the governor," Terence interrupted, pulling his phone from his pocket. "But I know someone who knows how to pull threads when things don't smell right." The next morning, a sleek black sedan pulled into her driveway, kicking up a cloud of dust. A tall, imposing woman in her early 50s stepped out, dressed not in the polished attire of a politician, but rather in the practical garb of someone who had spent more time in courtrooms than in corporate boardrooms. She introduced herself simply. "Valerie Knox. I do legal advocacy for veterans and federal land disputes." Terence called in a favor. Sarah led her inside, cautiously allowing herself a glimmer of hope, despite the overwhelming odds stacked against her. Valerie opened her laptop, scanned the documents with a practiced eye, and frowned almost immediately. "This acquisition order is weak," she stated, her voice sharp and decisive. "And it was rushed." Sarah blinked, her heart sinking. "Is that bad for me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Valerie shook her head, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. "No, bad for them," she replied. "They slipped up." Over the next several days, Valerie worked quietly but intensely, her focus unwavering. Valerie made calls to land registry offices, requested transcripts, and dug into the county's public records. Sarah watched from the side, trying her best to remain hopeful. Then, one afternoon, Valerie walked in with a small folder and a peculiar smile. "There's something you should see," she said. Inside the folder were copies of emails from Sheriff Dunning's office. One of them showed direct correspondence between Dunning and a Mayfield development executive. The subject line, "Timing the public hearing." Another included phrases like, "influencing the board," and "accelerate the reclassification." Sarah sat back, her hands feeling icy. Valerie nodded knowingly. "We have enough to open an ethics investigation, possibly more, but we need one more thing. Do you know if Dunning ever signed off on your father's lot papers?" Sarah rummaged through the old drawer where her father kept everything. Birth certificates, tax receipts, faded photographs. And then, there it was, a handwritten note from Dunning himself, dated years ago, confirming the parcel's designation as community support land. It wasn't just a defense. It was proof of betrayal. Valerie moved quickly. Within 48 hours, a formal complaint was filed. Local news picked up the scent. The phrases "conflict of interest" and "land misuse investigation" started appearing in news tickers, and for the first time in months, Sarah felt like she could breathe without feeling choked. Then came the hearing, not a courtroom, but a stuffy county office filled with chairs that squeaked and microphones that hummed way too loud. Valerie spoke first, presenting the evidence methodically. She laid out the inconsistencies, the inappropriate emails, the hidden correspondences, the past agreements buried beneath legal jargon. Then it was Sarah's turn. She didn't want to speak at first. She wasn't used to rooms full of strangers staring at her like she mattered. But she stood up anyway. "This land behind my house," she began, her voice surprisingly steady. "It isn't just dirt. My father grew food there. He gave it away to neighbors, to veterans, to anyone who needed it. It was part of our life. And when he passed, I tried to keep that going until someone decided it was worth more on paper than in people." There was silence, not heavy, just full. When the board voted, it was unanimous. The acquisition was declared invalid. The land was reinstated as protected use. The Mayfield proposal was dropped. Later that week, as Valerie packed her things, Sarah tried to thank her. Valerie waved her off dismissively. Thank the man who called me. Most people forget what service looks like when it doesn't come in uniform. Terence stood nearby, arms folded, saying nothing. Sarah turned to him. Why did you help me this much? He shrugged slightly. Because you didn't ask me who I was the first time. And because sometimes people don't need charity. They need a chance. That night, the garden lay still, the soil untouched since the fire. But it was hers again, safe. Not because someone gave it to her, but because she fought for it and because others fought beside her. The next day, a small notice appeared in the local paper. Sheriff Dunning placed on administrative leave pending investigation. No headline, no photo, but it was enough. Justice sometimes arrives quietly, like a stamp in the right place, or a signature finally used to protect, not take away. And in that quiet, something new took root. The earth behind Sarah's trailer smelled different after the fire and the fight that followed. There was still a trace of ash in the breeze, but it no longer felt like a warning. Felt like a memory. 1 week after the hearing, she stood again where her father once dug his roses. Sleeves rolled up, shovel in hand. The frost had started to melt early that season, and with each break of soil, Sarah felt a kind of quiet return taking shape. There was no fanfare, no applause, just the scrape of metal in the ground and her own breath steadying, as if something inside her had decided it was time to rebuild. She didn't need anyone to notice. She needed to know it was hers. By late afternoon, the beginnings of the new garden took form. A few cleared beds, a simple trellis, and in the corner near the fence, she hammered in a wooden sign. She painted it by hand using an old brush and leftover house paint. Each letter slow and deliberate. Free produce for veterans. No questions. It wasn't just a message. It was a promise she now understood the weight of. Her father never needed a sign. He had his hands and his word. But Sarah wanted it there not for attention, but so no one could forget what this place meant. Not anymore. Later that week, on a morning colored by birdsong and a faint wind, a dark sedan pulled up just beyond the edge of the driveway. Sarah was kneeling in the dirt, gloved hands covered in soil, when the door opened and Terence stepped out. He wore no uniform, no medals, nothing that called attention to who he had been or what he had done. Just a gray button-down and the same worn boots from the night he first showed up in the rain. In his hand, a small envelope. He didn't wave, just walked over, waited until she noticed, and said, almost like a question, "It looks better than it did." Sarah smiled faintly, wiping her face with the inside of her arm. "It's getting there." He handed her the envelope. "Thought you might want this." She hesitated, then opened it slowly. Inside was a single photograph. It was him standing on the steps of the Capitol behind a podium, his hands resting on the sides, his shoulders squared. But it wasn't the pose that made her stare. It was the sign in front of him, not printed, handwritten. In thick black marker on cardboard, it read, "She saw me when I couldn't see myself." Sarah held the photo tighter than she meant to, her voice cracking softly. "They let you say that?" "They didn't have a choice," Terence said, looking away toward the garden. "You gave me the words. I just said them out loud." They stood there for a long moment, the kind of silence that didn't press, didn't demand. It just made space. Terence nodded once, then stepped back toward his car. Before he left, he said quietly, "The garden looks like it remembers you." As he drove away, Sarah felt a strange stillness settle over her chest. It wasn't emptiness. It was the kind of calm that comes when something long bent finally finds its shape again. She tucked the photo inside the garden shed behind the box of seeds, not hidden, just waiting, like a root ready to sprout. Over the next few days, the garden drew quiet visitors. A man in a denim jacket came by and left without speaking, but returned the next day with a small sack of potatoes. A woman Sarah didn't recognize knocked softly and asked if she could leave a few starter plants from her own yard. And then there were the veterans, gray-haired, slow-moving, eyes sharp. Some nodded. Some left tokens on the porch, an old medal, a folded note, a carved cross. None of them stayed long, but their presence filled the silence that had once haunted Sarah's evenings. One morning, Liam ran out to the garden barefoot, holding a small tin can. "For the lettuce," he said proudly. "I saw that on a TV show." Sarah laughed, real and unguarded. It had been too long since she'd heard herself laugh like that. Carolyn from down the road came by one afternoon, slow but firm in her steps. She didn't say much either, just stood at the edge of the garden, looked over the roses, and nodded. "Your daddy would have liked this," she said. "He would have said it made the place feel like home again." Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat. "I hope so." Carolyn looked at her, eyes soft. "You didn't have to do this, you know." "I didn't," Sarah agreed. "But it felt like something that should stay." Carolyn placed a hand on her shoulder briefly. "Some things are worth keeping." That night, Sarah sat on the porch with Liam beside her, legs swinging off the edge. The stars had begun to prick the sky. The wind had that cool bite of early spring. Liam leaned his head on her shoulder and asked, not with worry, but with genuine curiosity, "Why do people keep coming here, Mom? They just look around and then leave." She thought for a moment, then said, "Because sometimes people don't know if they matter. And when they come here, something about this place reminds them that they do." Liam was quiet. Then he asked, "Did someone remind you?" Sarah smiled. "Yes, in the rain. One night I didn't expect." He nodded, content, and after a while he went back inside. But Sarah stayed. Her eyes drifted over the roses, over the trellis, the fresh soil, the little wooden sign catching moonlight. No plaque, no speeches, no credit, just seeds planted and grown, just a space where someone might be seen. The keepers of the fire. The mornings had turned softer in Maple Hollow. The sharp chill that used to greet Sarah when she stepped out onto the porch had mellowed into something gentler, something that carried the scent of soil, and the quiet creak of leaves swaying in a forgiving wind. The garden behind her home, once half-charred and written off by developers and doubters alike, now bloomed in defiance. It was never about perfect rows or pristine fences. It grew unevenly, a little wild, a little tired, but wholly alive like the people it welcomed. On the old plank that marked the garden's entrance, Sarah had painted in her own brushstroke, uneven and purposeful, "Free produce for veterans. No questions." Each morning she brewed coffee with the same care she used to reserve for guests, even though most who came by didn't knock. Some wandered in, heads lowered, eyes scanning not out of fear, but from the habit of being ignored for too long. Others came slowly, their pace slowed not just by age or injury, but by the weight of having survived things most people never talked about. Sarah didn't ask them why they came. She didn't need to. She offered a chair, a thermos of tea, or sometimes just silence, and watched the space between people shrink a little more each week. Liam had taken to spending his afternoons in the garden after school. He didn't say much about it, but she noticed the way he sat with one particular old man, a Navy vet who never used his real name, but always had a jar of pickled okra in hand. They'd talk in short bursts, sometimes only trading a few sentences the whole hour. But Liam always came back with that look Sarah hadn't seen in months, curious, grounded, a little older. One late morning, as Sarah was arranging a few fresh tomatoes in a crate near the edge of the garden, Liam came up behind her, hands in his hoodie pockets, his voice almost too quiet to hear over the wind. "Why do they come here?" he asked. Sarah turned. His eyes weren't challenging, just wide and searching. She wiped her hands on her apron, brushed a leaf from his shoulder, and answered as if she'd been waiting to. Because for a long time they thought nobody saw them. Not really. But now they know someone does. Liam tilted his head. "You mean you?" She smiled gently. "I mean anyone who looks at them like they belong. Sometimes one person doing that is enough to remind them they do." That afternoon, as the sun drooped lower behind the barn, a boy about Liam's age walked up the gravel path. Sarah didn't recognize him, but something in the way he held himself felt familiar. He was clutching a small brown envelope, worn soft at the corners. He didn't say hello. He just stood a few feet from her garden table, looking at the painted sign, then back at her. "Are you Miss Sarah?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. She nodded. "That's me." He swallowed. "My dad. He came here once. You gave him a basket and didn't ask anything." Sarah nodded again, slower this time. She remembered the man, rough beard, eyes too tired for someone his age. He said nothing, but took the tomatoes like they were something sacred. He doesn't smile a lot, the boy said, pressing the envelope into her hand, but he did after that. He said, "This place helped." Sarah felt the air shift heavier now. She opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a photo printed from a home printer, faded at the edges. The man was standing in his kitchen, holding up a small jar of canned green beans like it was a trophy. He was smiling wide, honest. He said to tell you thank you, that you reminded him he's not just someone people pass by. Sarah didn't speak, couldn't. Her throat tightened as she looked at the picture again. Then she looked at the boy and saw his father in his posture, in the guarded hope in his face. She reached into the produce crate, pulled out a ripe pear and handed it to him. "For him," she said softly. "Tell him the garden's always open." The boy nodded and walked back down the path, turning once to look back. Sarah watched him until the dust settled behind his sneakers. Then she sat down, picture still in hand, and let the silence stretch. It wasn't empty. It was full of things no one had said out loud. A few days later, she found Terrence's photo in the mailbox. No note, just a print, creased down one side, showing him at a podium in Washington. He was flanked by 2 other veterans. His jacket bore no ribbons, no signs of rank, just a plain pin on the lapel. He held a sign, the kind someone might scribble last minute at a protest, but his handwriting was unmistakable. "She saw me when I couldn't see myself." Sarah placed it next to the purple heart in her drawer, just beside the folded letter that started it all. No plaque hung in her garden, no newspaper article captured what had changed. But every leaf, every footprint in the soil, every quiet nod from a stranger who stayed just a little longer was proof that it had. Carolyn, who hadn't said much since the fire, began showing up again, usually with a basket of eggs or a quip about the weeds. One morning, as Sarah handed her a bundle of herbs, Carolyn looked out across the rows and said, not unkindly, "This isn't exactly what folks pictured when you said you were going to keep the land." Sarah grinned. "It's not what I pictured either." Carolyn looked back at her, eyes softening. "But it works. And it did, not just as a garden, but as something deeper. A place where pain wasn't asked to prove itself, where stories could exist without needing to be told, and where goodness was measured not in words, but in return visits and gentle hands." Years later, long after Liam had grown taller than Sarah, and long after the painted sign had to be redone from sun and time, the garden remained. People still came, some old, some new, some with limp steps, some in quiet pairs, some with burdens only their silence explained. But they came because somewhere along the way, a woman in the rain had made a choice not to look away. And that choice lit a fire that hadn't gone out. Sarah never called herself anything. Not a hero, not a leader. She just kept showing up, putting seeds in soil even when storms were forecasted, offering a seat even when her knees ached, smiling even when her heart was heavy. One day, a little girl pressed a dandelion into her palm and said, "My grandpa said, you make people feel real again." Sarah looked down at the yellow fluff, then up at the child and answered, "Sometimes all it takes is to be seen." And the garden, alive and quiet and stubborn as ever, kept growing. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts for staying with us until the very end of this story. It means more than you know. If the story touched you even in the smallest way, if it reminded you of the quiet power of kindness, of how one small choice can light a path for someone else, then we hope you'll carry that warmth with you wherever you are in the world. We'd love to know where you're watching from and how did the story make you feel. Your support helps keep stories like these alive, stories of true love, of acts of kindness, of quiet strength, of a simple woman who chose to see someone others overlooked. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more heartwarming stories, sleep stories, amazing stories, or grateful stories that bring hope and meaning, please give it a like, subscribe to our channel, and join us again next time. Until then, stay kind, stay human, and thank you for being part of this journey. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.